Chip Tam and football. That's what Pittsburgh does. What's up, everybody? It's Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, in for Brian Batko on his show this week. And I'm pleased to be joined by some Post-Gazette royalty, the Hall of Famer himself, Ed Bouchette. Ed, how have you been? How's retirement been? I'm excited to talk a little bit about the Steelers with you today. Usually we try to get you on here once a year, and we haven't yet, during the season. So I was excited to get your reaction to the season.
Yeah, everything's going well, Adam. I don't know about the royalty part. I left my crown back at the Post-Gazette when I left, I think.
I think a lot of people consider you royalty, Ed, and we're pleased to have you on. Pleased to get your thoughts on the Steelers today. Before we do, just want to thank our sponsor for this episode of the podcast. It's Pella Windows and Doors of Pittsburgh. There's no better place to get new windows and doors installed in your home than Pella, who can help you save on energy costs year-round. Schedule a free in-home consultation with your local Pella Windows and Doors to find the right product for your home and budget. Give them a call at 866-593-1560 to discuss your project further. That's 866-593-1560 to get started planning on your new windows and doors installation with Pella Windows and Doors of Pittsburgh. Okay, Ed, let's not get too specific off the top here. I just wanted to get your reactions to the 2024 season, how it ended, how the Steelers have responded in the early days of this offseason with not a whole lot of moves on the coaching front, and a lot of comments kind of defending the success that they have had despite this postseason losing streak. How have you digested that in the last few weeks?
Adam, I didn't have very high hopes for them going into last season because of a lot of reasons. They didn't have a number two wide receiver. That was a big deal to me. I thought their defense, even though it's highest paid in the league, was overrated. I mean, the highest paid came from basically three players. And then they needed more than at cornerback. They needed more in their defensive line. I thought they actually overshot what they should have done. I never saw them making the playoffs. But the collapse is what everybody's talking about. But remember, they played probably some of the best teams in the league there at the end of the season. And then, had to go to Baltimore to play that game in the playoffs. So I don't know if it was so much a collapse. I don't know that anybody picked them higher than 10-7. Maybe some people saw 11 wins, and that's what they got. So they're in rebuilding mode. Ever since Ben retired, they've had to rebuild, and until they find that quarterback, I think that we're going to see them continue to have to rebuild. Whether that's Justin Fields and he can come along and develop, I don't know. I don't know that. I don't know that they know that yet. They're going to have to go through a year with him, which is what I expect them to do, to see if that happens.
Yeah, I want to talk quarterback for sure in a little bit. The one question I did have for you, Ed, was the lack of playoff success that they have had in these last 8 years is unique in terms of, at least since the 1970s, since they were winning Super Bowls. They've never had a stretch this long, but it's not as if they haven't had downturns that you experienced firsthand. I think about the 1980s leading up to Chuck Noll leaving. I think about the late 1990s with the losing seasons under Bill Cowher. One of those downturns led to, obviously Chuck Noll leaving. Another one ultimately led to the 2005 Super Bowl, set the franchise up for that. Where on this spectrum do you feel like the Steelers are right now with Mike Tomlin and with the group that they have in place?
I don't see a lot of promise there, Adam. I really don't. You're talking about, let's say, some young coming players, right? I mean, that's what they had when they went through the 80s. I mean, I started covering them for the Post-Gazette in 85, and they went through a stretch of 7 seasons when they made the playoffs once. Not didn't win a playoff game, made the playoffs once. And that was Chuck Noll. So I don't see this as bad as that, but toward the end of the 80s, you saw a lot of young players coming up. Greg Lloyd, Rod Woodson, Carnell Lake, Darren Perry, that was setting them up for when Cowher came in and boom, they took off. What did they make the playoffs? 92 through 98. They made every year they made the playoffs. and they made AFC title games too, and won Super Bowl. I don't see this team doing that. And until they get a quarterback, they're never going to win another Super Bowl. Um, but I think we're also, and a lot of people don't like this, but I think Pittsburgh's spoiled. You mentioned all the success they've had, and yes, they have. And so everybody compares this team to those great years. Well, not a lot of teams have that. Not a lot of cities have that. Um, and I know Pittsburgh's expectations are higher, but that's why they're higher because they've had so much success. But I don't know that that means they're going to continue to have it, Adam, because they've had it in the past.
What do you think that that means for Mike Tomlin, Ed? If you're skeptical about the immediate future here, do you see Mike Tomlin getting through this in the macro? Obviously, he's going to be back next season. They've already made that decision. But do you think there will be some level of mutual parting at some point where the interests just don't align anymore because of where the franchise is? And let me ask you this as well: do you look at how much blame do you assign to Mike Tomlin individually for where they are, and how much of where they are is an organizational issue that I like to point out the drafts with Kevin Colbert late in that era were not good, and that they're still paying for some of the sins of that period of time, even though he's no longer around.
Listen, Adam, every coach has the final say. That started with Noll, it went through Cowher and Mike Tomlin. They're not bringing anybody in that Tomlin doesn't want. He gets who he wants, and that's the way it is. Whether it was Kevin or Omar, that's the way it is. So blame or praise or whatever, he's deeply involved. He coaches the defense. Everybody knows that now. Um, he's the man who hires the coaches. Who, to me, he's not done a very good job of that, hiring coaches. That's the one thing I don't think he's done a good job at. I think Mike is a good coach. I really do. But two of the greatest coaches in NFL history, Chuck Noll and Bill Belichick, both left their teams. Their time ran out. And sometimes that's just what happens, Adam. Your time runs out. I'm not saying Mike's there, but he's close. If it continues in this, I'm not going to call it mediocrity because they're making the playoffs, but it's Pittsburgh mediocrity.
Well, I think some people would argue that now there's 7 playoff teams now. You're mid pack in the conference. Just with the way that what that means, and obviously they got a higher seed than seventh this season, but not really. It was the 6th seed. So, I don't think it's unfair to call it necessarily mediocrity because I think the bar is a little bit lower than it once was. To what degree do you think, Ed, that the Steelers are loyal to Mike Tomlin? And to what degree do you think they feel he represents the franchise in the way that they want to conduct business, somewhat regardless of year-to-year results? Um, is there a level on which you think the Rooney family looks at possibly moving on from Mike Tomlin as moving on from themselves philosophically because he carries out, the way this franchise wants to win with running the ball and defense and those types of things?
Yeah, I think they wanted to run the ball because that's where their strengths were this past year, or supposed. That's where they thought they were, Adam. When you only have one good wide receiver and you're starting a quarterback who never did anything in Chicago, and then you have to switch quarterbacks in midstream. Now, Russell Wilson's had a lot of experience, obviously, but still, I think they were a little hesitant to devote more to the passing game because of that. This coming year, we'll see. Are they going to have any receivers at all this coming year? I don't know. I don't expect Pickens to be back. Um, so, look, I sat down with Dan Rooney once in the '80s when things were going bad, and I asked him about Chuck, and Dan said, "We don't have coaches for life here." Meaning anything could happen. Chuck wasn't given a blank slate to stay on forever, and I don't think that would be the case with Mike. Although there's a new Rooney in charge now, and I think Art has shown he's very comfortable with Mike. He gets along with Mike. I think they see eye to eye on a lot of stuff. But nevertheless, he also has some, I will call them minority owners who have been nipping at his heels through the years on Mike. That's been reported, here and there for a while. So a lot more goes into it than I think just feeling comfortable with what they're doing.
And I wanted to pull at that thread a little bit of you mentioning how Dan Rooney's philosophy was with coaches. You covered him more closely than anyone did through all of those Super Bowl victories. How do you think he would be handling the situation differently, if at all, than the way Art is now? Because I know that's a big talking point. I think less so with the media, but certainly with fans who look back fondly on Dan Rooney and feel like Art's stewardship of the franchise hasn't quite measured up to that. I mean, what would you say to that and your read of how Dan Rooney conducted himself compared to his son?
Yeah, I don't know that anybody could measure up to what Dan did here, starting by hiring Chuck Noll and then winning 4 Super Bowls in 6 years, Adam. They actually won their last Super Bowl with Art as president. Dan had turned things over to him and then he became ambassador to Ireland. But I don't know that he would do anything different. The one big thing Dan did was in 1988. They went 5-11, and he sat down with Chuck, and he ordered him to get rid of some coaches. And included in that was Tony Dungy was the youngest defensive coordinator in the league, and he ordered him to demote him to secondary coach. And Dungy wouldn't take it and wound up leaving. But he fired a number of coaches, and then guess what? 89, they went to the playoffs, and then in 90, after the 91 season, when they didn't make the playoffs 2 years in a row, Dan was going to tell him he wanted to make more changes, and Chuck just didn't want to go through that again, so he retired. Art has already done that with Mike Tomlin. He did it with Bruce Arians, and I think maybe an offensive line coach. I'm not sure, but I think he's done it with a couple coaches, made them get rid of them. And I think he was involved in hiring Todd Haley as a replacement for Bruce Arians as the coordinator on offense. So he's done some of that, but I think Dan would be sitting down maybe soon with Mike and wanting him to look at his coaching staff, because like I said, I don't know that that's the greatest coaching staff that's come down the pike in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, and it's early in the offseason. People, listen, the trades and the free agency and the NFL draft, those all get the clicks, the attention. But, we're in that first wave of when you make changes, Ed, in a season. Right now, all you've really done is change an inside linebackers coach. So it'll be interesting to see how that process continues to unfold or whether it's done unfolding. You mentioned the quarterbacks at the top. I wanted to return to that topic a little bit. You mentioned that you think that they should move forward with Justin Fields. I just wanted to give you a chance to explain that a little bit further in comparison to Russell Wilson, A, and then B, in comparison to what else might be available. Matthew Stafford, Aaron Rodgers are names that a lot of fans talk about. Obviously, you have the draft to look toward. There are some names in there that people are interested in. Why is Justin Fields the guy for you at this moment?
Because I think he has more potential, not more than Russell Wilson, let's just say that. But Russell isn't taking them anywhere this year. They're not going anywhere. So if you're not going anywhere, why do the same thing over and over again? You need to find out about Fields. He has the potential. He can run. He threw some nice passes last year. He's taller. I don't think Russell can see over the middle. He's too small. I think that's a reason they didn't throw a lot over the middle. He can throw that moon ball, straight up in the air. But when it comes down to throwing it over the middle like that, he's just not good at that. He's best when he's getting on the outside. Now he's getting a little old to keep doing that, rolling out and throwing on the outside. So I would go with Fields, and I might draft one. Not in the first round. I don't know that. First of all, you're not going to get a crack at any of the good ones in the first round. I don't know that there are any good ones there, franchise guys there anyway. anywhere. But I'd take one in the third or fourth round. You never know. And it can be your backup quarterback, if you will. But I wouldn't go out and sign one of those other guys you mentioned, Adam. It's just more of the same, wash, rinse, repeat. And if you don't get the answer you want this year from Fields or whatever, you got to go draft one next year. You just have to.
Ed, I think a lot of people feel that this team is not going to compete seriously without a franchise quarterback. But you've lived through, some examples of them doing so. Neil O'Donnell getting them to Super Bowl 30. You've been to AFC Championship games with Cordell Stewart, Mark Malone. What lessons do you think the Steelers can take from those years that were in between Bradshaw and Roethlisberger, and applying them to team building around a quarterback who may not be, a Hall of Famer, but could be good enough to get you where you want to go?
Yeah, they had decent quarterbacks back then. People want to say they had nothing between Bradshaw and Ben. Well, they did. Bobby Brister was not a bad quarterback. He was on a bad team. And, he showed that when he went to Denver. He got 2 Super Bowl rings and actually saved John Elway one year when he was hurt. And Brister came in and won a bunch of games for them. Neil O'Donnell when he was here for a couple of years, was a good quarterback, and then he left. He left at the top of his game. And Cordell Stewart was their MVP in the 0-1 season and made the Pro Bowl that year. So I just don't think they knew how to use. They gave Cordell like 5 different offensive coordinators. They kept changing them every year, and I don't think any of them had any consistency on how to use him. Nowadays, Cordell would be a star in this league. He'd be up there with the Baltimore quarterback, I think. But they just didn't know how to use him. So the lessons, you got to keep trying to find quarterbacks. If you don't find one this year, you go next year. If he ain't the guy, you go the next year. Of course, you have to have a little patience if you're going to get a young guy that you think has potential, and that could take a few years. But, unless you go 3 and how many games they play now? 17, 3 and 14. You're not going to get a top crack at that quarterback. So you're going to have to be creative and either try and get up there or find one the way Baltimore did in, the end of the round.
Ed, I want to talk to you about receivers a little bit, because I know you were on with Jason Mackey on the Fan about a week ago, and you talked about how you'd move on from George Pickens if the value proposition was right. Was there anything you wanted to add to that thought or explain, A? And then B, what has gone on with the Steelers and receivers in this last handful of years, where it seems like every talented guy they get in here, the relationship goes sour one way or the other. Antonio Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster,
Davis Bryant.
Yes, exactly. And then Deontay Johnson and
Chase Claypool. He got lucky there. They traded him for, would they get a high second pick? He's Joey Porter.
Yes.
I don't know. They're either drafting the wrong guys, or they come here and they take the Antonio Brown approach that, I'm a diva and you have to cater to me. I don't know. I don't know what's going on. They haven't done a very good job of developing and keeping those guys. Maybe Antonio Brown spoiled them, that he became a diva, but he helped them win so much and was so good on the field that they thought these other guys they could do the same thing with, and it hasn't worked out. Pickens, it's an old Buddy Ryan saying when he traded a guy to the Steelers, he said, get him out of here, get a 6-pack for him. It doesn't even have to be cold. That would be my feeling with George Pickens. I would trade him for anything I could get. If you can get a 3rd rounder, God bless you. But, he, to me, he doesn't fit into this team. He's not providing a winning attitude with this team. And I would find some other wide receivers, whether it's the draft. I don't know. Just go get them. They should have done that last year. They needed a second rounder, and they thought they were going to sign somebody here or sign somebody there or trade for somebody, and it never happened.
Can they remake that group in an offseason, Ed? Just because I don't think there's a lot of examples in Steelers history of them saying, we're gonna re-rack the whole wide receiving core here, at least the top two guys. Or is this going to be a multi-year project to get where they want to go at that position?
Well, the kid they drafted in the 3rd round, Wilson,
Roman Wilson.
Maybe he's one of them that's going to help you. You can remake it. It might cost you some money. I don't know what's out there, Adam. I don't know what's available, trade, free agency. I don't look at that stuff anymore. You definitely have to draft one. And I know they want to remake their defensive line. I'm not so sure I wouldn't get a receiver in the 1st round this year because you need 2. You need 2. You need 2 at least because Pickens, to me, I don't think he's going to be here.
Ed, you led in my next question about the defense well. I think the way that this unit's performed in the playoffs has been unique in franchise history of, meltdown after meltdown after meltdown. And we can, parse the offense all we want, but when you're giving up yards and points the way they have in these playoff games, it almost doesn't matter, what's going on with the offense. And something I wanted to ask you about, because I remember after that playoff loss to Denver in 2011 or at the end of the 2011 season, there were already conversations about that group that led you to 2 Super Bowl wins, a 3rd one in 2010, so only a year earlier. There was a lot of conversation of this group's done. That Tebow pass to win that playoff game in Denver was kind of the nadir of that group. Some of those guys hung around, but I think the belief was that they were going to have to go into some level of rebuilding. At what point does that conversation become appropriate about this Steelers defense with Minkah Fitzpatrick, TJ Watt, Cam Heyward being the core of that?
Those 3 guys you mentioned, other than that, they've been rebuilding. They've been trying to get guys in the defensive line, granted not in the 1st round. They've signed some guys, some veterans who may not be back. The inside linebackers are totally different. The cornerbacks, other than Joey Porter, who is only in his 2nd year, are different. The safety, other than Minkah, is different. Those 3 guys you mentioned are the reason they have such a high payroll. Now, I expect Cam to be back. I hate to say it, Adam, but I'd look at moving TJ Watt and Minkah. I mean, TJ's going to be 31. Are you going to win with him? Is he going to be 36 years old the next time you're competitive? I don't know. But if I could get something good for him, I would do it. And I don't think they'd miss Minkah at all. I mean, they didn't miss him this year, even though he played every game, right?
Well, I've argued, for much of the season that whatever you'd miss from Minkah Fitzpatrick is outweighed by what, payroll you would free up to bring in other guys. And I think $20 million plus to a safety is the problem. I don't know if it's necessarily his play per se. I understand why they like him and his ability to take away the middle of the field, but is that worth $20 million? That's always been my question. And my answer is no. So I'm curious to see, how you feel about not just I think he's a good player, but is he good enough to justify that salary?
Not the way they use him. And, he was a ball hawk before. And why you would take a ball hawk and put him back there in center field where he had 1 interception in 2 seasons? Is that what it is, Adam? 1 interception in 2 seasons?
He certainly won this year. I know that.
He only had 1 this year, and it came late in the year. I remember when I was on the Hall of Fame board and we sat around and discussed the final 15 the day before Super Bowl, and a Krause guy from Minnesota was up for it, and somebody said, he had a ton of interceptions. I forget how many, a ton of interceptions. And somebody said, he's a free safety. He's supposed to get interceptions. Well, what's Minkah?
Yeah. Yeah, and he has his, I think, devoted fans, and maybe for good reason. But those conversations were even appropriate about Troy Polamalu at the end of his career. I don't understand why, for some people, they're not appropriate about Minkah Fitzpatrick, considering what you brought up in terms of the turnovers. Ed, you brought up the Hall of Fame and those conversations. I wanted to get your feeling on a couple of guys who got snubbed in some fans' view again this year. Hines Ward, James Harrison, neither one of them got in. What did you think of that development? And do you think either of those guys eventually gets in? Or are there just too many players now coming up that are have places in the Hall of Fame more or less locked up that it's going to make it difficult for a Hines Ward to break through?
Yeah, let me say, I think both are Hall of Famers, but I don't think either of them are ever going to make it, Adam. I mean, that's just being realistic. The problem for Hines is he's never cracked that 15 that I just mentioned. The thing with the Football Hall of Fame is Hines always makes they vote by mail, blah, 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 blah. They get it down to 25, and then they vote by mail again. And then they take those top 15 into the room where they spend all day discussing them. It's on Zoom now, but it used to be in one big room before the Super Bowl. And so nobody's ever been able to discuss Hines inside that place and debate his attributes and what he does. It's just all email, or you see somebody or you call somebody, and it's not the same. And James was a late bloomer, and I think that's hurting him a little bit because his stats aren't where a lot of the others are. And let's face it, outside linebackers now and defensive ends in a 4-3 defensive end are judged on sacks. It doesn't matter. They're judged on sacks. And while he had a ton of sacks for 4 or 5 years there, the core of his playing days here, over the long haul, it doesn't add up. And to me, he made the greatest play in Super Bowl history, greatest play in Steeler history, by the way, and I will debate that against the Immaculate Reception fans in the Super Bowl. But, it's just not going to be enough, I don't think.
Ed, how many Hall of Famers are on the Steelers today? I think that's a hot topic for some people. Does Cam get in? Does Minkah get in? Or is TJ the only guy you look at? I'm going to exclude Russell Wilson from this conversation because the balance of his career happened elsewhere. But just in terms of homegrown guys who've spent most of or all of their careers with the Steelers, is that part of the issue here? Is that you look at that roster and you say, I don't know if any of these guys are going to be locks for Canton beyond TJ Watt.
Yeah, certainly TJ, and Defensive Player of the Year helps. That second one would have put him in for good. Cam, he's going to be borderline, I think. Minkah, I don't think. And, their careers aren't over yet, especially Minkah's and TJ's. But I don't see Minkah as a Hall of Famer right now. That could change. They could change how they use him, and he could have, 15 interceptions this year. But right now, I don't think so. And anybody else you want to talk about, I don't see anybody anywhere.
Are there any young guys you like, Ed? Not necessarily in terms of the Hall of Fame, but some of these guys they brought in these last couple drafts that have gotten results. I think a lot of people like Zach Frazier at center, for example, and hope he can be, the next guy in that lineage. Are there any young players who've stood out to you that you have a level of hope about them blossoming into being stars, whether they make the Hall of Fame or not?
Yeah, I like that Benson. Benson, right?
Benton. Keeanu Benton.
Thank you. I liked him. He seemed to fall back a little bit this year, but I really liked. He looked like a boy for a couple times there. He looked like I'm going to be blasphemous here, like a young Aaron Donald there for a little bit. And I'm not comparing him, but he had some of those attributes on the inside. I don't think he's a nose tackle per se. I think he's more of a Cam Heyward kind of guy. That's how they should use him. He has a good inside push and everything else. I think Joey Porter has some real potential, and he needs to harness his a little bit more of his pushing and shoving and stuff. But I like the aggressiveness on him. I think he can be good. Yeah, I don't know if anybody else who's young they brought in. I mean, the other safeties seem to be okay that they had this year. But That's about it. I don't see any real. That's why I said that, in the late 80s, they had all these young guys coming up, and I don't see that now, Adam.
Did you watch any of Hard Knocks, Ed? I know, it was something a lot of Steelers fans looked forward to because they resisted it for so long, and now they're finally on the show. Did you catch any of that? And was there anything that was, if so, was there anything behind the curtain you found interesting?
I'm just thankful, Adam, they had it after I retired, because I did not want to have to react to all that stuff in training camp, and especially I don't get HBO, so I wouldn't have seen it. But I saw it, some early ones this year, and then I got bored. They seem to scrub it of all the good stuff anymore. I've never been a big Hard Knocks guy. I didn't watch hardly any of that stuff anyway, but from what I understand, they now each team gets approval for what goes on the air. And so I'm not a Hard Knocks fan. I don't know. Everything has to be wired up and everything else now. You can't function without it going before the public. But, to me, it was boring.
Yeah, I can certainly see that argument. I think once you got past there's this level of access, and because it was split up between 4 teams. I don't think there was enough time to dig into, any one team in the depth that some people may have liked. But Ed, those are all the questions I had for you. Was there anything else you wanted to say to Steelers fans? Any final thoughts on the season that was before we, possibly talk to you again next year?
Well, I could advise them to have a little patience, because it's going to take a while, I think. But advising Steelers fans to have patience is like telling them not to go to Permane Brothers anymore. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, well, we'll see how the offseason unfolds. Ed, thanks for stopping by. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the Post-Gazette Sports Now YouTube channel. Everyone else, Brian will be back in this spot next week, so make sure you're subscribed to the channel. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button. Help us out with the YouTube algorithm. We always appreciate that. And I will be back on Thursday with Jason Mackey. So a lot more coming your way this week. Thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.